Medieval times. The very phrase conjures images of knights in shining armor, castles towering into the sky, and mysterious figures lurking in dark forests. But what was it really like to survive in those times? For most people, it was far from romantic or adventurous. It was a struggle, a daily grind of hard labor, harsh conditions, and a fight just to stay alive. If you think the Middle Ages were exciting, you might be in for a surprise or maybe a snooze. This isn't a dramatic retelling of epic battles or heroic quests. It's the truth about surviving medieval times, and it's boring in the best way possible. The reality is that the vast majority of people in medieval Europe were peasants, tied to the land, working fields under the watchful eyes of their lords. Life was governed by the seasons, the weather, and the whims of nature. Disease was a constant threat. Food was scarce and repetitive, and personal safety was never guaranteed. In fact, most people probably felt like they were simply waiting for the next catastrophe, whether it was famine, war, or plague. But amidst all this monotony and hardship, medieval people found ways to survive, adapt, and even find moments of joy. Before we dive into the gritty details, let's set the scene. Picture a typical medieval village, a cluster of simple wooden homes with thatched roofs, narrow dirt paths winding through fields of crops and livestock. The air smells of smoke from cooking fires and the earthiness of animals. Daily life revolves around farming, plowing fields, sowing seeds, tending animals, harvesting crops. Work starts early at dawn and stretches until dusk. Tools are basic: wooden plows, sickles, and scythes. There's no machinery, no shortcuts, just sweat and muscle. Most peasants are serfs, bound to the land they work on. They don't own the land. Instead, they owe rent and labor to a local lord who controls the manor. This feudal relationship defines much of their existence. The lord's manor is the center of power and justice. Peasants must give a portion of their harvest as tax and work the lord's fields on certain days. Failure to comply could mean punishment, even eviction. For many, the horizon feels closed in by these social and economic chains. Food is another challenge. The medieval diet is dull and monotonous. Bread is the staple, often made from coarse rye or barley flour. Meat is rare, usually reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Instead, people eat a lot of pottage, a kind of stew, made from whatever vegetables, grains, and sometimes meat scraps are available. This repetitive diet leaves people malnourished and vulnerable to disease. Malnutrition is common, and vitamin deficiencies cause ailments like scurvy or rickets. Hygiene standards are minimal by modern reckoning. Bathing is infrequent, and water sources can be contaminated. This contributes to the spread of diseases. Medical knowledge is rudimentary and often mixed with superstition. Illnesses like the plague or smallpox can decimate entire communities in weeks, and doctors have few effective treatments. People turn to prayer, herbal remedies, and sometimes dangerous folk cures. The medieval home is a crowded, smoky space. Families often live in one or two rooms with a dirt floor and a central hearth for cooking and warmth. Furniture is sparse wooden benches, tables, and a few chests. There's little privacy. Everyone sleeps close together, sometimes even with animals. Winters are brutal, with cold and damp seeping into the walls. Firewood is precious, and fuel is rationed carefully. Survival depends heavily on community. Villages are tight-knit, with families relying on each other for help during planting, harvest, and emergencies. Shared labor and resources are common. Festivals and religious holidays punctuate the calendar, offering rare breaks from work and moments of celebration. Despite the hardships, medieval people find ways to cope. Storytelling, music, and simple games provide entertainment. Faith offers hope and a framework to understand suffering. The church dominates life, offering rituals, guidance, and a promise of salvation beyond this world. As we peel back the layers of medieval life, you'll see that surviving those times wasn't about daring exploits. It was about endurance, routine, and community. It was boring painfully, excruciatingly boring, and that's what made it possible to survive. This isn't a tale of kings and battles. It's the story of everyday people living one day at a time. So get comfortable, maybe even a little sleepy, because we're going to take a long, slow journey through the reality of medieval survival. And trust me, the truth about surviving medieval times is the kind of boring history that might just help you drift off to sleep, but it's also a story worth knowing. One of the most important aspects of medieval survival was the relentless cycle of seasons, which dictated the rhythm of every person's life. Spring arrived slowly after long, harsh winters. For peasants, the first sign of spring wasn't the blooming flowers or warming sun, but the time to prepare fields for planting. The soil had to be broken, which required plowing with heavy wooden plows drawn by oxen or horses. Oxen were more common for their strength and endurance, though slower, while horses were faster, but more expensive to keep. Plowing was hard, grueling labor. The plow was a simple wooden frame with an iron tip that cut into the earth, but it was heavy and difficult to maneuver. Many fields had tough clay or rocky soil that made the task even harder. Peasants often worked from sunrise until sunset, their backs bent and muscles aching. Every inch of land was precious, because crop failure meant starvation. Once plowing was done, seeds had to be sown by hand. Most common crops were grains like wheat, rye, oats, and barley. Wheat was the most prized but required better soil and more care, so poorer peasants often planted rye or barley instead. These grains were ground into flour to make bread the staple of the medieval diet. Seeding was done carefully, scattering handfuls of grain across the field, hoping the rains and sun would nurture enough growth. Alongside the fields, peasants raised small livestock: chickens, pigs, sheep, and sometimes cows. Livestock was vital not just for food, but for materials like wool, leather, and manure for fertilizer. Pigs were particularly prized for their ability to forage in the forest. Shepherds watched over sheep to protect them from wolves and thieves, walking miles each day to keep the animals safe. The daily diet of a medieval peasant was dull and repetitive. Breakfast might consist of cold bread dipped in ale or sour milk. Ale, a low-alcohol fermented drink made from barley, was consumed regularly because water was often unsafe. Lunch was often pottage, a watery stew made from vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbage, and root vegetables such as turnips and parsnips, sometimes thickened with grains. Meat was rare and highly valued. When available, it was often salted or smoked to preserve it for longer periods. On religious feast days or special occasions, people might enjoy roasted meat, fish, or fresh dairy products, but these were rare treats. Fish was important especially on days when the church forbade eating meat. Inland, freshwater fish like carp or eels were common, while coastal areas had access to saltwater fish. Preservation of food was another challenge. Without refrigeration, peasants used salt, smoking, or drying to keep meat and fish edible for longer. Surplus crops were stored in granaries or cellars, but rodents and damp could spoil supplies. The constant fear of a bad harvest, pest infestation, or harsh winter that destroyed food stores was always on their minds. Medieval hygiene standards were primitive. People rarely bathed, often only a few times a year, believing that bathing opened the pores to disease or that water could carry illness. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, but were also viewed with suspicion or as immoral places. Clothes were infrequently washed and mended repeatedly, sometimes worn for years. Hair was washed less frequently than today, and lice infestations were common. Sanitation was a major problem. Waste disposal was crude. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets or ditches. In villages, this contaminated water sources and created breeding grounds for flies and rats. Towns tried to manage this with drainage ditches or public latrines, but hygiene remained poor. This contributed to the spread of diseases, which often came in waves and devastated populations. Medical care was a mixture of rudimentary science and superstition. The medieval medical worldview was influenced by the ancient Greek concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and treatments aimed at balancing these through bloodletting, purging, or herbal remedies. Physicians were rare, and most care was provided by local healers, monks, or midwives using herbal concoctions, prayers, or charms. The Church played a dual role. On one hand, it promoted faith as the path to healing and salvation. On the other, monasteries preserved medical knowledge and sometimes provided care for the sick. Hospitals existed, but were more like places for rest and prayer than modern medical centers. During plagues, communities often fell into panic, turning to flagellants groups who whipped themselves to atone for sins or blaming minorities, which led to violence. The Black Death of the mid-13th century is one of the most notorious examples of medieval disease. Originating in Asia and spreading via trade routes, it ravaged Europe, wiping out up to 60% of the population in some areas. The disease caused painful boils, fever, and often death within days. Entire villages were sometimes wiped out, and the social and economic consequences were profound. Homes in medieval villages were simple and small. Most peasants lived in one- or two-room cottages made from timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, providing poor insulation against cold and rain. Floors were dirt, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw, to provide some warmth and reduce mud. Inside, the hearth was the focal point, providing heat and a place to cook. Smoke from the fire often filled the rooms, as chimneys were rare. This made breathing difficult and led to respiratory problems. Furniture was sparse: wooden stools, benches, and a few chests for storage. Beds were simple, often just sacks stuffed with straw or feathers, shared by entire families. Privacy was minimal, and noise and odors filled these cramped spaces. Clothing was utilitarian. Wool was the primary material, providing warmth and durability. Peasants wore tunics, cloaks, and simple linen shirts. Shoes were made from leather, but often thin and worn out. Nobles had more elaborate clothing made from fine fabrics and adorned with embroidery or jewels. But even they faced practical constraints. The social structure of medieval life was rigid. Feudalism bound peasants to the land and to their lords, who owned the manors. Peasants owed labor, taxes, and a share of their harvest to their lords, often leaving them with barely enough to survive. Lords held courts that judged minor disputes and punished transgressions. The justice system was harsh and unforgiving, with corporal punishment, fines, or imprisonment common. However, villages were communities. People shared labor and resources. Neighbors helped each other with heavy tasks like harvesting or building. Festivals, fairs, and religious holidays offered breaks from the monotony, with music, dancing, and communal feasting. These moments fostered social cohesion and lifted spirits, even if only temporarily. The Church influenced every aspect of life. Religious festivals marked the calendar, from Christmas and Easter to local saints' days. The Church taught that suffering in this life was a test of faith, with the promise of eternal reward. This belief helped people endure hardship, but it also reinforced social hierarchies, encouraging obedience to earthly authorities as part of God's plan. Education was rare for peasants, but vital in monasteries and for the nobility. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving ancient texts and religious writings. Universities began to emerge in the High Middle Ages, but literacy remained low among the general population. Stories, songs, and oral traditions passed knowledge and culture from generation to generation. In towns, life was bustling, but often squalid. Narrow, crowded streets were lined with timber-framed houses stacked close together. Open drains ran through streets, and garbage was frequently dumped outside homes. Tradesmen and merchants operated workshops and markets, while townspeople had more opportunities for trade and crafts. They also faced disease outbreaks, fires, and social unrest. Survival in medieval times was a delicate balance. People depended on their land, their community, and their faith. Every year brought uncertainty. Will the harvest be good? Will the rains come? Will disease strike? The constant struggle bred resilience but also resignation. Understanding this daily reality gives us a clearer picture of medieval life, not as the romanticized age of chivalry, but as a hard, slow, and often boring existence that people endured with grit and faith. Life in medieval times was a constant dance with uncertainty, a tightrope walk over a chasm of dangers and hardship. The everyday reality of surviving was marked not only by the physical challenges, but also by the mental and emotional strain of living in a world where a single misstep could mean disaster. The rhythm of the seasons governed every aspect of life. Winter was particularly brutal. Villages nestled under heavy snows, with frozen fields lying fallow and livestock struggling to survive the cold. Heating was minimal. Homes had small hearths that barely warmed the rooms. People layered themselves in thick wool and animal skins, but frostbite and hypothermia were real threats. Winter meant rationing food carefully, as the stores from the harvest had to last until spring. Starvation was common after long winters, forcing many to resort to eating roots, bark, or even rodents when supplies ran out. Spring brought cautious hope, but also intense labor. The thaw turned muddy fields into swamps, making planting difficult. Fields had to be prepared quickly to take advantage of the short growing season. Peasants worked tirelessly to plow, sow, and tend their crops. The plowing was backbreaking, done with wooden plows, pulled by oxen or horses. Oxen were preferred by poorer peasants for their hardiness, though they were slow. Horses were faster, but required more care and cost more to feed. The soil was tough, often compacted or rocky, and farmers had little technology to ease the burden. Planting was a delicate process. Seeds had to be scattered evenly to ensure good growth. Some fields were planted with wheat, which was the staple grain, but also with rye, barley, and oats, depending on the soil quality and regional preferences. Rye was more hardy and could grow in poorer soils, but made a coarser bread. The bread was central to the diet, dense, often dark loaves that sustained families through the year. Gardens were small, but crucial. Peasants grew vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, and peas. These were eaten fresh or preserved by drying or pickling. Fruit trees were less common but prized. Wild berries and herbs were foraged from nearby woods, adding flavor and nutrients to meals. Animal husbandry was equally important. Most peasants kept pigs, chickens, and sometimes sheep or cows. Pigs were particularly valuable because they could forage in the forest, consuming acorns, roots, and scraps. Chickens provided eggs and meat, while sheep gave wool for clothing and occasionally meat. Cows were more expensive and less common, often used for milk, butter, and cheese. The care of livestock was a year-round job. Animals had to be fed through winter, often on stored hay or grain. Diseases like hoof rot, worms, and infections were common and could wipe out herds. Predators such as wolves and dogs threatened livestock, and villagers had to be vigilant. Water sources were vital, but often contaminated. Wells were dug near homes, but runoff from fields, waste, and latrines frequently polluted drinking water. Boiling water was not common practice, so waterborne diseases spread rapidly. Rivers and streams were sometimes used for washing clothes, bathing, and fishing. But bathing itself was rare due to cultural beliefs associating water with disease. The medieval diet was monotonous and calorically minimal for peasants. Meals revolved around bread, porridge, and pottage, a thin, savory stew made from vegetables, grains, and occasionally bits of meat or fish. Ale was the main drink, brewed locally in every village. It was safer than water due to fermentation killing pathogens and had a low alcohol content. Ale was consumed throughout the day, even by children, as hydration and nutrition combined. Meat was a luxury. Hunting was reserved for nobles, and peasants were forbidden from hunting game on lords' lands. Domestic meat came from slaughtering animals when necessary, but animals were more valuable alive for milk, eggs, wool, or labor. Preservation methods included salting, smoking, or drying, as refrigeration was non-existent. Preserving food was a critical survival skill. Salt, imported from coastal regions or mined inland, was precious for curing meat and fish. Smoking meat over low fires added flavor and extended shelf life. Fruits and vegetables were dried or pickled in brine or vinegar. Grain was stored in granaries, often raised off the ground to prevent moisture and pests. But infestations by weevils and rodents were common threats. Hygiene was primitive by modern standards. Bathing was infrequent often, just once or twice a year during festivals or religious occasions. This was due partly to superstition. Many believed water opened pores to evil spirits or disease. Clothes were rarely washed, patched, and reworn until threadbare. People combed their hair and treated lice with herbal remedies, but infestations were persistent. Sanitation was poor. Chamber pots emptied into the streets or cesspits. Villages had open ditches or basic latrines that contaminated water supplies. Flies and rodents thrived in this environment, spreading diseases. The smell of waste mingled with smoke and cooking fires, making the air thick and unpleasant. Medical care was a mixture of rudimentary knowledge and superstition. Illnesses like fevers, infections, wounds, and parasites were common and often fatal. Treatments included herbal remedies, poultices, bloodletting, and prayers. Physicians were rare and often expensive. Monks and nuns in monasteries provided care, combining spiritual guidance with simple medical practices. Folk healers used plants like willow bark, a precursor to aspirin, garlic, and honey, but their success was limited. The church's role was significant in health and survival. Religious beliefs shaped explanations of disease as punishment for sins. Pilgrimages and relics were believed to have healing powers. Hospitals existed, but were places of refuge rather than centers of scientific medicine. Social life revolved around family, work, and faith. Families were large, but infant mortality was high. Children learned chores early and contributed to the household economy. Men typically worked the fields or crafted goods, while women managed domestic tasks, including cooking, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and caring for children and the elderly. Marriage was both a social and economic contract. Dowries and land rights influenced unions. Women's legal rights were limited, but they played vital roles in managing households and sometimes businesses. Villages were tight-knit communities. People relied on neighbors for labor exchange, protection, and social support. Festivals and religious holidays provided brief respite from toil, featuring feasts, dancing, music, and religious ceremonies. In towns, life was denser and more varied. Craftsmen formed guilds to regulate trades and protect members' interests. Markets and fairs allowed trade in goods from distant regions. However, urban life also brought overcrowding, poverty, and disease outbreaks like plague and typhus. Violence was a constant hazard. Lords and knights enforced their authority with armies and retainers. Bandits preyed on travelers and isolated homes. Feuds and rebellions erupted occasionally, often harshly suppressed. Law and justice were harsh and uneven. Trials might include ordeals by fire or water, oaths, and witness testimony, often biased by status and power. Punishments included fines, flogging, mutilation, and execution. Despite this grim reality, medieval people demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They adapted farming techniques, built sturdy homes, developed rich cultural traditions, and forged communities that endured centuries of hardship. This endurance laid the groundwork for future transformations in Europe. The slow improvements in agriculture, the rise of towns and trade, and the preservation of knowledge in monasteries set the stage for the Renaissance and the modern era. Understanding the true nature of survival in medieval times strips away the romantic myths and reveals the strength and tenacity required to live through an era often misunderstood as merely boring or primitive. Instead, it was a world full of challenges met with human courage and creativity, where every day was a test of survival. Medieval society was fundamentally a hierarchical system, structured with distinct classes, each with its own responsibilities, privileges, and vulnerabilities. The upper echelons, the monarchs, nobles, and knights, enjoyed privileges unimaginable to peasants. Yet their survival also hinged on maintaining power and navigating complex political landscapes. Below them, the clergy wielded immense spiritual and often political influence, guiding not only faith but education and law. The peasants, who formed the majority, lived a life of grueling labor, uncertainty, and vulnerability. Their work was the foundation upon which the wealth and security of the upper classes rested, yet they reaped few rewards. The day began before dawn and ended well after sunset, centered on the demanding agricultural calendar. The labor was backbreaking, plowing fields with wooden implements pulled by oxen or horses, sowing seeds, tending crops, harvesting, and managing livestock. Any failure in crops could mean famine, starvation, or forced migration. Famine was a persistent threat. The medieval climate underwent fluctuations known as the Little Ice Age, bringing colder, wetter conditions that shortened growing seasons and increased crop failures. Food shortages led to malnutrition, weakened immune systems, and increased susceptibility to disease. During famines, people ate whatever they could find: roots, wild plants, and even tree bark. Cannibalism, though rare, was reported during extreme starvation. Food scarcity influenced every social interaction and decision. Marriages, births, and festivals were carefully timed to seasons of abundance. Surpluses were rare and typically stored for times of need, but storage was imperfect, and grain often spoiled or was stolen. Theft of crops or livestock was common in desperate times, but punishable by severe penalties. The domestic life of peasants was austere. Homes were typically 1 or 2 rooms with dirt floors, no windows, and little furniture. The hearth was the center of the home, used for cooking and heating, but it produced smoke that filled the small space and contributed to respiratory problems. Sanitation was rudimentary. Waste was disposed of nearby, contaminating water and attracting flies and rodents, which spread disease. Clothing was practical and simple, made from wool or linen, spun and woven locally. Garments were often patched and handed down through generations. Personal hygiene was minimal, not just from superstition, but also due to scarce water supplies and the difficulty of bathing in cold weather. Children's survival rates were low. Many did not live past infancy due to disease and malnutrition. Those who survived were expected to contribute to household labor from a young age. Education was reserved mostly for boys, destined to join the clergy or nobility. Peasants learned trades and farming by apprenticeship or family tradition. The church's influence permeated all aspects of life. Monasteries were centers of learning, preserving classical texts and producing manuscripts by hand. They also served as hospitals and places of refuge. The church dictated moral codes, social behaviors, and even legal matters. Religious festivals provided rhythm to the year, offering moments of celebration and relief from toil. However, faith also reinforced social hierarchies. The concept of the great chain of being justified the status quo, teaching that everyone's place was divinely ordained. Peasants were encouraged to accept their lot with patience, promising reward in the afterlife. Healthcare was primitive. Medical practitioners had limited understanding of anatomy and disease. Treatments were based on theories like the imbalance of humors, and often involved bloodletting, purging, or herbal remedies. Surgery was rare and dangerous. Epidemics, such as the bubonic plague, smallpox, and leprosy, devastated communities, killing vast proportions of the population. Sanitation problems exacerbated the spread of disease. Waste was often dumped in streets or waterways. Overcrowded towns with narrow streets and contaminated water supplies were breeding grounds for illness. Leprosy patients were ostracized, living in separate colonies with minimal care. Despite these hardships, medieval people created vibrant cultures. Art, music, and literature flourished, often centered on religious themes, but also including secular stories and folklore. Manuscript illumination, stained glass, and monumental cathedrals reflected sophisticated craftsmanship and deep religious devotion. Technology slowly advanced. The heavy plow allowed cultivation of tougher soils. Watermills and windmills improved grain processing. Crop rotation methods enhanced soil fertility. Innovations spread unevenly, but gradually improved productivity and living standards. Trade networks expanded, connecting Europe with Asia and Africa via the Silk Road and Mediterranean routes. Towns grew as commercial hubs, attracting artisans, merchants, and bankers. Markets and fairs were lively events that offered access to goods from distant lands, spices, textiles, and luxury items. Guilds emerged as important social and economic institutions in towns. They regulated quality, prices, and apprenticeships for crafts such as blacksmithing, weaving, and masonry. Guilds provided mutual aid and social identity, helping members survive economic downturns. Warfare was a constant presence. Knights trained for battle, while peasants were sometimes conscripted or involved in local conflicts. Castles and fortified towns were centers of defense, but also of oppression. Armed violence affected everyone, from skirmishes to large-scale wars like the 100 Years' War. Legal systems were complex and often biased. Lords held courts that administered justice, sometimes harshly punishing crimes like theft or rebellion. Trial by ordeal and combat were methods used to determine guilt, reflecting a belief in divine intervention. Survival in medieval times was thus a multifaceted struggle. It involved negotiating environmental hazards, social constraints, disease, and violence. It demanded physical endurance, social cunning, and sometimes spiritual resilience. This complexity makes medieval history both challenging and fascinating. By peeling back the layers, we see a world far from boring, a world where every day was a fight to exist, and where human ingenuity and community were essential lifelines. Medieval life was defined by a constant negotiation with hardship, uncertainty, and the environment. Survival was not merely a matter of individual will, but required adaptation to the complex systems of social hierarchy, economic demands, and the natural world. Every aspect of daily existence, from what people ate, how they clothed themselves, where they lived, to how they coped with illness and conflict, was shaped by these factors. Food was the foundation of survival, and medieval diets reflected both availability and social status. The peasantry's diet was monotonous and heavily reliant on grains like barley, rye, and oats, often baked into coarse bread or boiled into porridge. Vegetables such as onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans were common, but fresh produce was often seasonal and limited. Meat was a rare luxury for peasants, typically reserved for special occasions or the hunting privileges of the nobility. Instead, peasants consumed small amounts of dairy, eggs, and fish, especially in regions near rivers or coasts. Preservation techniques were crucial due to the seasonal nature of farming. Smoking, salting, pickling, and drying helped extend the life of meats and vegetables. Root cellars and cool storage areas within homes or barns were used to store root vegetables and grains. Malnutrition was a constant threat during harsh winters or poor harvests, contributing to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and susceptibility to disease. Shelter was modest and functional, The majority of peasants lived in small, one-room cottages made of wattle and daub, a mixture of wooden strips woven together and covered with clay or mud. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, which, while effective at shedding water, posed a constant fire hazard. Inside, space was shared by the entire family, and often their animals during winter, making for cramped and smoky living conditions. Furniture was minimal, usually limited to benches, a table, and simple beds made from straw-filled sacks or wooden planks. In contrast, the nobility lived in stone castles or manor houses, designed for defense and status. These were often cold, damp, and drafty, but featured large halls for gatherings, private chambers, and more sophisticated kitchens and sanitation systems. Castles also served as administrative centers, symbolizing the lord's power and control over the surrounding lands. Clothing was another indicator of social status and a matter of survival against the elements. Peasant clothing was made from wool or linen, spun and woven locally. These garments were often homespun, simple in design, and dyed with natural substances such as woad, blue, or madder, red. The clothing was functional and layered to provide warmth, patched and mended repeatedly due to scarcity of materials. Nobles wore more elaborate clothing, often imported or made from finer fabrics like silk and velvet, richly decorated with embroidery and jewels. The family unit was central to medieval survival. Families were typically large, with many children, partly due to high infant mortality rates. Men were primarily responsible for farming, hunting, and protection, while women managed household tasks, food preparation, childcare, and often assisted in agricultural labor. Extended families and village networks provided mutual support, sharing resources, labor, and knowledge. Marriage was both a personal and economic arrangement, often used to consolidate land or forge alliances. Health was precarious, and medical knowledge limited. Common illnesses included respiratory infections, gastrointestinal diseases, and parasitic infestations, worsened by poor sanitation and malnutrition. Epidemics could wipe out entire villages. The Black Death of the 14th century killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population. Medical treatment was a mix of herbal remedies, religious rituals, and rudimentary surgical procedures. Physicians were rare and expensive. Most people relied on local healers, midwives, and folk remedies. Sanitation was a major problem. Waste disposal was minimal, with human and animal waste often dumped near homes or into rivers, contaminating water sources. Public baths existed, but were few, and bathing was infrequent, partly due to fears of catching illnesses or moral concerns promoted by the church. Technology played a crucial role in improving survival. The heavy plow allowed for cultivation of the rich northern European soils, boosting agricultural output. The three-field crop rotation system helped maintain soil fertility by alternating crops in fallow periods. Watermills and windmills mechanized grain grinding, increasing efficiency. Innovations in animal husbandry improved livestock breeds, providing more reliable food and labor. Trade and markets connected medieval communities to broader networks. Towns grew as centers of commerce and craft, attracting artisans and merchants. Markets offered access to goods, not locally produced spices from Asia, fine textiles, metals, and luxury items. This exchange also introduced new ideas and technologies, facilitating gradual social and economic change. Guilds emerged to regulate trades, maintain quality, and protect members. They controlled training through apprenticeships, established standards, and provided social support, including care for members in illness or old age. Guilds wielded political power in towns and influenced urban development. Violence was an omnipresent threat. Warfare between rival lords, kingdoms, and invading forces could destroy crops, homes, and lives. Castles and fortified towns were built to withstand sieges and raids, but also served as instruments of control and oppression. Peasants sometimes took up arms during revolts or were conscripted into armies. Justice was administered through a patchwork of local courts and royal edicts, often harsh and arbitrary. Punishments were public to deter crime and maintain order. Trial by ordeal or combat reflected a belief in divine justice, rather than evidence-based procedures. Despite these adversities, medieval people forged meaningful lives. They developed rich cultural traditions, music, poetry, festivals, and religious ceremonies that offered comfort and identity. Communities celebrated saints' days, harvest festivals, and weddings, creating moments of joy amid hardship. In essence, surviving medieval times required resilience, adaptability, and cooperation. It was a constant balance between exploitation and protection, toil and celebration, suffering and hope. Understanding this truth dispels myths of a dark, static past and reveals a vibrant, if challenging world where human spirit endured against immense odds. Life in the medieval period was a complex web of survival strategies, deeply influenced by the environment, social hierarchies, religion, and evolving technology. To truly understand what it meant to survive during this era, one must delve beyond surface-level histories and examine the lived realities of common people, their fears, innovations, and daily struggles. A crucial element of survival was how medieval people dealt with disease and injury, two of the most persistent threats in a world lacking modern medical knowledge. The absence of germ theory meant that illnesses were often misunderstood, attributed to supernatural forces or imbalances of bodily humors, rather than micro. This misconception shaped medical practices and public health measures, or the lack thereof. Medical practitioners ranged from learned physicians who had studied at universities to folk healers and midwives relying on traditional knowledge. Physicians, often educated in places like Salerno or Montpellier, based their treatments on ancient texts by Hippocrates and Galen. These treatments included balancing the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, through bloodletting, purging, and herbal concoctions. Unfortunately, such practices often weakened patients rather than healed them. Midwives played a vital role, especially in rural areas. They not only assisted with childbirth, but also treated common ailments, using herbs like chamomile, sage, and willow bark. These plants contained compounds with analgesic and anti-inflammatory properties, showing that medieval herbalism, though primitive, had practical benefits. Plagues and epidemics were devastating. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people. Its rapid spread was facilitated by fleas on rats, which thrived in the filthy, overcrowded conditions of medieval towns. Public health responses were limited. Quarantine measures were rudimentary and often ineffective. Sanitation was rudimentary and often dangerous. Waste disposal systems were primitive. Human and animal waste frequently contaminated drinking water. Rivers and wells were common water sources, but were also polluted, spreading waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera. Bathing was infrequent, partly due to fears that water opened pores to illness, and moral disapproval by religious authorities, which saw public bathing as sinful. Nutrition was another pillar of health and survival. Peasants' diets were monotonous and nutritionally limited, dominated by grains and vegetables. Protein sources were scarce, except for occasional fish or small amounts of meat. This dietary deficiency made people susceptible to scurvy, anemia, and other illnesses linked to poor nutrition. Despite hardships, medieval societies developed communal systems to care for the sick and elderly. Monasteries often ran hospitals, offering rudimentary care and spiritual comfort. Charity was a religious duty, and almsgiving was common, especially during times of crisis. Another significant aspect of survival was the role of women. Women's labor was critical both inside and outside the home. They managed households, prepared food, made clothing, and cared for children and the elderly. In rural areas, Women worked in the fields alongside men, tending crops and livestock. Women's legal and social status was limited, but some wielded considerable influence, particularly widows and noblewomen who managed estates. Women also played key roles in crafts, especially textile production, which was a vital industry in medieval economies. Education was mostly reserved for the clergy and nobility, though some towns developed schools. Literacy was rare among peasants. Knowledge was transmitted orally and through apprenticeships, focusing on practical skills needed for survival. Technology and innovation steadily improved medieval life. The heavy plow allowed farming on heavier soils, increasing food production. Water and windmills mechanized grain processing. The introduction of the horse collar and horseshoes enhanced transportation and agriculture. Crop rotation methods replenished soil nutrients, increasing yields. Trade expanded, linking Europe with Asia and Africa. This exchange brought new goods, technologies, and ideas. Towns became centers of commerce, with markets and fairs attracting merchants from afar. Banking and credit systems began to develop, facilitating larger-scale trade. Feudalism structured society, but was also evolving. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for military service, creating complex networks of loyalty. Peasants were bound to the land, paying rents and performing labor. However, the rise of towns and a money economy began to undermine purely feudal relationships, creating new opportunities for social mobility. Religion permeated every aspect of life, shaping laws, morals, and social order. The church was a powerful institution, influencing kings and commoners alike. Religious festivals and pilgrimages provided spiritual meaning and communal bonding. Warfare was frequent and brutal. Castles and fortifications were both defensive structures and symbols of power. Knights trained for combat and chivalry, while foot soldiers and peasants were often conscripted. War disrupted agriculture, trade, and daily life, causing destruction and displacement. Justice was harsh and arbitrary. Crimes were punished severely to maintain order, with little regard for fairness by modern standards. Trials by ordeal or combat were used, reflecting beliefs in divine intervention. Survival in medieval times was a constant balancing act, requiring resilience, cooperation, and adaptation. Despite the hardships, people forged communities, created culture, and laid the foundations. Surviving medieval life was not merely about enduring harsh conditions. It required mastering a complex array of skills and navigating a rigid social framework that shaped every aspect of existence. Agriculture, the backbone of medieval economies, was a constant source of both sustenance and anxiety. Farmers employed techniques like the three-field system, which rotated crops to preserve soil fertility. One field for winter grains like wheat or rye, another for spring crops such as barley or oats, and the last left fallow to recover. This innovation improved yields compared to older methods, but yields remained precarious due to unpredictable weather, pests, and soil exhaustion. Even a single bad harvest could plunge a village into famine. Animals were invaluable for medieval survival. Oxen or horses pulled plows, enabling more land to be tilled with less human labor, while cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats provided meat, milk, wool, and leather. Managing livestock required knowledge of breeding cycles, seasonal feeding, and disease prevention, though veterinary care was primitive. Outbreaks of diseases like rinderpest or hoof rot could decimate herds, devastating a community's food and income sources. Peasants often housed animals inside their cottages during winter for warmth and protection, but at the cost of hygiene and respiratory health. Housing reflected social and economic realities. Peasant homes were small, often just 1 or 2 rooms with dirt floors and minimal furniture. Walls made from wattle, woven wooden strips, and daub, mud and straw, offered basic protection from the elements, but were vulnerable to cold, damp, and vermin. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, materials prone to fire and decay. Inside, A hearth served as the center of cooking and heating, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or gaps in the walls. The smoke contributed to respiratory ailments, but also helped preserve meat hung overhead. Nobles, by contrast, lived in stone castles or timber-framed manor houses with multiple rooms, glass windows, in rare cases, tapestries for insulation, and dedicated kitchens, although even these homes were cold and drafty by modern standards. Clothing was both practical and symbolic. Peasant garments were made from coarse wool or linen, hand-spun and woven in local households. Clothes were simple, often homemade, and designed for durability over style. Layering was essential in colder months, with tunics, cloaks, and woolen stockings common. Dyeing was done using local plants woad for blue, madder for red, and weld for yellow, resulting in muted colors. Nobles enjoyed access to imported silks and velvets, with bright colors and elaborate embroidery signifying status and wealth. Clothing was expensive and valuable, so even peasants repaired and reused garments extensively. Feudal society rigidly structured medieval life. Lords owned vast estates and demanded rents and labor from peasants, who were often serfs tied legally to the land. The manor was the focal point, encompassing the lord's domain, peasant holdings, woodlands, and common pastures. Peasants owed various obligations, working the lord's fields several days a week, paying rents in kind or coin, and providing services like milling grain or repairing roads. This system entrenched social hierarchies and limited mobility, but also provided some protection and community organization. In return for their labor, peasants received access to land for their own subsistence farming, as well as rights to gather firewood or graze animals on common lands. With time, towns began to emerge as centers of commerce and craft, offering alternatives to rural, manorial life. Urban populations grew steadily from the 12th century onwards, fueled by trade routes, fairs, and the demand for specialized goods. Guilds formed to regulate trades such as blacksmithing, weaving, and baking, setting standards, training apprentices, and controlling prices. Guild membership offered social security, mutual aid, and a degree of political influence within towns. Craftsmen and merchants in towns often enjoyed greater freedoms and could amass wealth, challenging the traditional feudal order. Religion was a dominant force, shaping both worldview and daily practices. The Catholic Church's pervasive influence extended from spiritual life to education, law, and governance. Monasteries were centers of learning, agriculture innovation, and medical care. People believed illness and misfortune could be divine punishment, prompting prayers, pilgrimages, and participation in religious festivals. Saints' relics attracted pilgrims and served as focal points of communal identity. The Church also provided charity, supporting the poor, sick, and elderly through almsgiving and hospital care. Healthcare was rudimentary. Physicians, often trained in classical texts, offered treatments that balanced humors through bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies, though success rates were low. Common people relied on midwives, herbalists, and folk healers. Epidemics like the bubonic plague could decimate populations, and leprosy was feared and stigmatized, leading to isolated leper colonies. Sanitation was poor, latrines were scarce, and waste contaminated water supplies, spreading disease. Bathing was infrequent, partly due to religious teachings and beliefs about health. Education was limited, but evolving. Most people were illiterate, with knowledge transmitted orally or through apprenticeships. Monastic schools and cathedral schools educated clergy and nobility, teaching Latin, theology, and the liberal arts. The establishment of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries began a slow process of intellectual advancement, though access remained limited. Warfare was a constant backdrop. Lords engaged in conflicts over land, power, and honor. Castles served as fortresses and administrative centers. Knights trained from childhood in combat and chivalry, but also engaged in brutal warfare that devastated landscapes and civilian populations. Peasants might be conscripted as foot soldiers or bear the burden of providing supplies and labor. The impact of war extended beyond the battlefield, disrupting agriculture, trade, and social stability. Despite all hardships, medieval people found ways to create community, culture, and hope. Festivals, fairs, and religious ceremonies provided respite and joy. Music, storytelling, and art flourished in courts and villages alike. Innovations in agriculture and technology slowly improved living standards. Trade expanded, connecting distant regions and introducing new goods and ideas. Surviving medieval times meant confronting a world of uncertainty and danger, but also one of ingenuity, resilience, and human connection. Understanding this complexity offers a richer, more authentic perspective on a pivotal era in human history. For modern Europe, medieval life was shaped by a delicate balance between the forces of nature, the demands of social structures, and the will to survive in a world often indifferent to human needs. To truly grasp the essence of surviving the medieval period, it is necessary to explore not only the tangible hardships people faced, but also the cultural, psychological, and spiritual frameworks that sustained them. Food scarcity remained one of the most persistent and life-threatening challenges. The medieval peasant's diet was heavily dependent on seasonal harvests, which dictated the availability of grains, vegetables, and fruits. The reliance on a few staple crops, primarily rye and barley, meant that crop failures led swiftly to famine. In years of poor harvest, communities resorted to desperate measures, eating roots, tree bark, or even turning to scavenging. Market towns sometimes provided alternatives, where dried or salted fish, imported grains, or preserved foods could be bought. But these were often beyond the means of the poorest. In such times, hunger was not merely a discomfort, but a cause of profound physiological and psychological suffering. Chronic malnutrition weakened immune systems, increasing susceptibility to diseases like tuberculosis and dysentery. Starvation also led to social unrest, riots, and rebellions erupted when food shortages became acute, challenging the authority of lords and kings. To mitigate these risks, medieval farmers employed crop rotation systems and manured fields to maintain soil fertility. The introduction of the heavy plow in northern Europe allowed cultivation of heavier clay soils previously unusable, expanding arable land. Additionally, innovations like the three-field system improved productivity by rotating winter grains, spring crops, and fallow land, thereby reducing soil exhaustion. Animal husbandry played a complementary role in survival. Beyond providing meat, milk, wool, and leather, animals like oxen and horses were essential for plowing and transportation. Managing livestock required careful attention to breeding, feeding, and disease prevention. Diseases such as foot and mouth or rinderpest could devastate herds, threatening both food supply and agricultural labor. Peasants often housed animals within their dwellings during winter, a practice that, while providing warmth, exacerbated unsanitary living conditions and spread zoonotic diseases. Housing in medieval times reflected social status and environmental constraints. Peasant cottages were small and functional, constructed from wattle and daub or timber, with thatched roofs. Floors were often simply packed earth and furnishings minimal. These homes were poorly insulated, exposing inhabitants to cold winters and damp conditions, contributing to respiratory illnesses. Fire was a constant hazard, as open hearths provided necessary heat and cooking facilities but could easily ignite the flammable building materials. Nobility lived in more substantial stone structures, ranging from fortified castles to manor houses. Castles were built not only as residences, but as military fortifications, with thick walls, battlements, moats, and drawbridges. Inside, these castles contained great halls for communal meals, private chambers, chapels, and storage rooms. However, even castles lacked modern comforts. Heating was uneven, sanitation primitive, and daylight limited by narrow windows. Clothing was both a necessity and a marker of identity. Peasants wore garments woven from locally produced wool or flax, often homespun and rough in texture. These clothes were patched and repurposed extensively due to the expense of materials. Colors were generally muted, browns, grays, and dull greens or blues, reflecting the limited availability of dyes. Nobles adorned themselves in fine fabrics, like silk and velvet, imported through expanding trade networks, often dyed in vibrant hues and embellished with embroidery and fur trims. Clothing conveyed social status and occupation, reinforcing the rigid hierarchies of medieval society. Feudalism was the overarching social system that dictated land ownership, labor obligations, and governance. Lords controlled vast estates, extracting rents, labor, and military service from peasants and vassals. Serfs were legally bound to the land, unable to leave without permission, but had certain customary rights, such as access to common pastures or woodlands. The manor was the economic hub, with the lord's domain managed directly by peasants or overseers. This system was reciprocal, but heavily skewed in favor of the nobility, ensuring their wealth and power. The rise of towns and cities in the High Middle Ages began to challenge feudal norms. Urban centers attracted merchants, artisans, and laborers, offering relative freedom from rural obligations. Guilds emerged as organizations that regulated trades, maintained quality standards, trained apprentices, and provided mutual aid. Membership in a guild was often a pathway to economic security and social status within towns. The growth of commerce linked medieval Europe to distant regions, bringing spices, textiles, and luxury goods from Asia and the Mediterranean. Religion was deeply embedded in daily life, influencing worldview, behavior, and social order. The church was a powerful institution that not only provided spiritual guidance but also education, healthcare, and charity. Monasteries preserved classical knowledge, cultivated lands, and operated hospitals. Religious festivals punctuated the calendar, offering communal celebrations and temporary relief from labor. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common, motivated by faith, penance, or the hope for miracles. Health and medicine were rudimentary. Physicians relied on classical texts and theories of humors, prescribing treatments that often did more harm than good. Folk remedies, herbal medicine, and spiritual healing coexisted as common practices. Epidemics, such as the plague, caused widespread mortality and fear. Sanitation was poor, waste disposal systems were primitive, and water sources often became contaminated, spreading diseases like dysentery and cholera. Bathing was infrequent, constrained by social norms and limited facilities. Education was largely limited to the clergy and nobility. Literacy rates were low among the peasantry, with knowledge transmitted orally and through apprenticeships. Monastic and cathedral schools preserved classical learning and trained clergy, while the rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries began to expand intellectual horizons, though access remained restricted. Warfare was endemic, affecting both nobles and commoners. Castles and fortified towns served as defensive bastions. Knights trained extensively in martial skills, embodying ideals of chivalry, though actual warfare was often brutal and chaotic. Peasants could be conscripted or forced to support armies through labor and provisioning. The impact of warfare extended beyond the battlefield, disrupting agriculture, trade, and social stability. Despite the harshness of medieval life, people cultivated rich cultural traditions. Music, storytelling, and art flourished in courts and villages. Festivals, fairs, and religious ceremonies provided moments of joy and community. Innovations in agriculture, technology, and trade gradually improved living conditions. Survival in medieval times was a testament to human endurance, adaptability, and faith. Understanding the intricate interplay of social, economic, and environmental factors reveals a world far more complex and dynamic than simplistic portrayals suggest. It invites a deeper appreciation for the resilience and ingenuity of those who lived through this challenging era. The end of the medieval period was not a sudden or straightforward event, but a gradual transformation shaped by many forces converging over centuries. To fully understand how people survived the medieval world and what legacies they left behind, it is essential to dive deep into the social, economic, cultural, and technological changes that began to reshape Europe. The persistent threat of famine and food insecurity remained a defining feature of medieval life. But by the late Middle Ages, agricultural innovation and changing climate patterns brought some relief. The introduction of new crops such as beans, peas, and later potatoes, diversified diets, and improved nutrition for many. The enclosure movement in England and elsewhere began to change land use, increasing efficiency, but also displacing peasants and provoking social tensions. Despite this, rural communities continued to rely on a patchwork of subsistence farming, communal rights, and seasonal labor to sustain themselves. Livestock management also evolved. Selective breeding and better veterinary practices, though still rudimentary, helped improve herd sizes and quality. Sheep farming expanded significantly, driven by the growing demand for wool in burgeoning textile industries. The wool trade became a cornerstone of medieval economies, linking remote rural areas to international markets and enriching merchant classes. However, this economic shift had complex social consequences, sometimes deepening inequalities between landowners and laborers. Housing and living conditions showed incremental improvements, but remained challenging. Urbanization brought new housing forms, with timber-framed townhouses and multi-story buildings that packed growing populations into limited spaces. Cities grappled with sanitation issues, overcrowding, and fire hazards, prompting early forms of municipal governance and infrastructure planning. In rural areas, peasants faced the enduring hardships of weather exposure and poor construction materials. Yet they developed communal strategies for repair and maintenance, reinforcing social bonds. Clothing reflected both continuity and change. The rise of textile guilds in towns promoted innovations in weaving, dyeing, and tailoring, producing garments with greater variety and quality. Sumptuary laws emerged, regulating who could wear certain fabrics or colors, reinforcing social hierarchies but also sparking resistance and adaptation. Peasants and townsfolk alike found ways to express identity and status through clothing within the constraints of their means. Feudalism, the defining social structure of the medieval era, began to fracture as new economic opportunities emerged. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, dramatically altered labor dynamics. The massive loss of life caused labor shortages, empowering surviving peasants to negotiate better wages and conditions, or move to towns for freer lives. Serfdom declined in many regions, though it persisted elsewhere, reflecting a patchwork of experiences. The shift from a land-based economy to one increasingly influenced by commerce and money reshaped social relations profoundly. The growth of towns brought not only economic change, but cultural flourishing. Guilds regulated craftsmanship and trade, providing apprenticeships, quality control, and social support. Urban centers became hubs of intellectual life, art, and political organization. Markets and fairs connected local producers to distant consumers, spreading ideas and goods in unprecedented ways. These developments laid foundations for the Renaissance and the early modern period. Religion continued to permeate all aspects of life, but challenges to ecclesiastical authority emerged. The late medieval church faced criticism for corruption, wealth, and the disconnect between clergy and laypeople. Movements like Lollardy in England and the Hussite Rebellion in Bohemia questioned traditional doctrines and practices, foreshadowing the Reformation. Nevertheless, the Church's role in education, charity, and community cohesion remained vital. Pilgrimages and religious festivals continued to provide meaning and social integration. Healthcare slowly progressed through the combination of classical medical knowledge, folk remedies, and empirical observation. Universities trained physicians, and hospitals became more organized, though access remained limited. Public health crises such as recurrent plague outbreaks prompted rudimentary quarantine measures and urban sanitation efforts. The understanding of disease causation remained primitive, but practical measures sometimes reduced suffering and death. Education expanded beyond clerical elites with the rise of universities and increased literacy among the urban middle classes. Scholarly inquiry challenged long-held assumptions, fostering intellectual curiosity that would blossom in the Renaissance. Vernacular literature and the advent of the printing press democratized knowledge and transformed cultural life. Warfare, though brutal and disruptive, stimulated technological innovation in weaponry, fortification, and logistics. The use of gunpowder and cannons began to alter the nature of sieges and battlefields. Knights and chivalry gave way to professional armies and new military tactics. The social impact of warfare was complex, affecting peasants as conscripts and victims, but also as active participants in changing political orders. Despite the adversity, medieval people nurtured a rich cultural tapestry. Music, from sacred chants to secular ballads, resonated across halls and villages. Storytelling preserved history and morality lessons, while illuminated manuscripts and art conveyed spiritual and worldly themes. Festivals and communal rituals punctuated the harsh rhythms of life with moments of joy and transcendence. The resilience of medieval communities lay in their capacity to adapt and find meaning amidst hardship. Social networks of kinship, patronage, and guilds provided support. Faith offered solace and a framework for understanding suffering. Innovations in agriculture, trade, and technology gradually improved living standards. As the medieval world transitioned into the early modern era, the legacies of survival social structures, cultural traditions, technological advancements continued to influence European society. Understanding the complexity of medieval survival enriches our perspective on history, highlighting the interplay of endurance, change, and human creativity. In the end, the story of surviving medieval times is not just one of suffering, but of profound human strength. It reminds us that even in the face of uncertainty and danger, communities forged lives rich with purpose and connection, laying the groundwork for the world we inherit today.